Good morning, third and fourth graders. It's time to continue our next section of the BFG. When we left off, Sophie came up with the idea of how to rid the world of the man-eating giants, and she suggests that the BFG create a dream that shows the giants going off and eating children, especially English children, every night, and about the BFG and Sophie. And they're going to create this dream and blow it into the Queen's bedroom. Now, the first part is how the BFG creates the dream. It's really quite fun. It's called Mixing the Dream. It was dark now. The night had already begun. The BFG, with Sophie sitting on his hand, hurried into his cave and put on those brilliant, blinding lights that seemed to come from nowhere. And he placed Sophie on the table. "Stay there, please," he said, "and no chittering. I is needing to listen only to silence when I is mixing up such a naughty, plexicated dream as this." He hurried away from her. He got out an enormous empty glass jar that was the size of a washing machine. He clutched it to his chest and hurried toward the shelves on which stood the thousands and thousands of smaller jars containing the captured dreams. "Dreams about giants," he muttered to himself as he searched the labels. "The giants is guzzling human beings. No, not that one, nor that one. Here's one. And here's another." And he grabbed the jars and unscrewed the tops. And he tipped the dreams into the enormous jar he was clutching. And as he went, and as each one went in, Sophie caught a glimpse of a small sea green blob tumbling from one jar into the other. The BFG hurried toward another shelf. "Now," he muttered, "I is wanting dreams about giggle houses for girls and about boggle boxes for boys." And he was becoming very intense now. Sophie could almost see the excitement bubbling inside him as he scurried back and forth among his beloved jars. There must have been 50,000 dreams altogether up there on the shelves, but he seemed to know almost exactly where every one of them was. "Dreams about a little girl," he muttered, "and dreams about me, about the BFG. Come on, hurry up, get on with it. Now, where in the wonky world is I keeping those?" And so it went on. In about a half an hour, the BFG had found all the dreams he wanted, and had tipped them into the one huge jar. He put the jar on the table. Sophie sat watching him, but said nothing. And inside the big jar, lying on the bottom of it, she could clearly see about 50 of those oval, sea-green, jellious shapes, all pulsing gently in and out, some lying on top of others, but each one still a quite separate individual dream. And here's a wonderful picture of the BFG going to his shelves and pulling down the exact dreams he needs for mixing up the right dream for the Queen. "Now he is mixing them," the BFG announced, and he went to the cupboard where he kept his bottles of Frobscottle, and from it he took out a gigantic egg beater. Now, I searched my house for my egg beater, and I must have gotten rid of it because I don't have it anymore. But an egg beater is, well, he describes it here. It was one of those that has a handle which you turn, and down below there are a lot of overlapping blades that go whizzing round, and he inserted the bottom end of the contraption into the big jar where the dreams were lying. "Watch," he said, and he started turning the handle very fast. And here is the picture of the BFG using the egg beater. Oh gosh, I gotta get this just right for you because it's a great picture. And he's mixing the dreams in the jar, and Sophie's sitting on the table watching. Now, maybe you have an egg beater at home. You hold the top, and there's a handle that you turn, and it moves these two blades at the bottom. I don't know what I did with mine. I guess I haven't used it in a long time. Flashes of green and blue exploded inside the jar. The dreams were being whisked into a sea green froth. "The poor thing," Sophie cried. "They is not feeling it," the BFG said as he turned the handle. "Dreams is not like human beings or animals. They has no brains. They is made of zazzamus." And after about a minute, the BFG stopped whisking. The whole bottle was now full to the brim with large bubbles, and they were almost exactly like the bubbles we ourselves blow from soapy water, except that those had even brighter and more beautiful colors swimming on their surfaces. "Keep watching," the BFG said. Quite slowly, the topmost bubble rose up through the neck of the jar and floated away. A second one followed, then a third and a fourth, and soon the cave was filled with hundreds of beautifully colored bubbles, all drifting gently through the air. It was truly a wonderful sight. As Sophie watched them, they all started floating up toward the cave entrance, which was still open. "They're going out," Sophie whispered. "Of course," the BFG said. "Well, where to?" "Those is all the little tiny dream bits that I isn't using," the BFG said. "They is going back into the misty country to join up with proper dreams." "Oh, it's all a bit beyond me," Sophie said. "Dreams is full of mystery and magic," the BFG said. "Do not try to understand them. Look in the big bottle, and you will now see the dream you is wanting for the queen." Sophie turned and stared into the great jar, and on the bottom of it something was thrashing wildly about, bouncing up and down and flinging itself against the walls of the jar. "Good heavens!" she cried. "Is that it?" "That's it," the BFG said proudly. "But it's horrible!" Sophie cried. "It's jumping about. It wants to get out." "Oh, that's because it's a Trogglehumper," the BFG said. "It's a nightmare." "Oh, but I don't want you to give the queen a nightmare," Sophie cried. "Well, if she is dreaming about giants guzzling up little boys and girls, then what is you expecting it to be except a nightmare?" the BFG said. "Oh, no," Sophie cried. "Oh, yes," the BFG said. "A dream where you is seeing little chidlers being eaten is about the most frightsome troggle-humping dream you can get. It's a Kixie Bog Thumper. It's a Wopsy Grop Switcher. It is all of them riddled into one. It is as bad as that dream I blew into the flesh lump eater this afternoon. It is worse." Sophie stared down at the fearful nightmare dream that was still thrashing away in the huge glass jar. It was much larger than the others. It was about the size and shape of, shall we say, a turkey's egg. It was jellyish. It had tinges of bright scarlet deep inside it. There was something terrible about the way it was throwing itself against the sides of the jar. "Oh, I don't want to give the queen a nightmare," Sophie said. "I is thinking," the BFG said, "that your queen will be happy to have a nightmare if having a nightmare is going to save a lot of human beings from being gobbled up by filthsome giants. Is I right or is I left?" "I suppose you're right," Sophie said. "It's got to be done." "She will soon be getting over it," the BFG said. "Have you put all the other important things into it?" Sophie asked. "When I is blowing that dream into the queen's bedroom," the BFG said, "she will be dreaming every single thing-a-ling-ling you is asking me to make her dream." "About me sitting on the windowsill?" "That part is very strong." "And about a big friendly giant?" "I is putting in a nice long gobbet about him," the BFG said. And as he spoke, he picked up one of his smaller jars and very quickly tipped the struggling, thrashing Trogglehumper out of the large jar into the small one. Then he screwed the lid tightly onto the small jar. "That's it," he announced. "We is now ready." And he fetched his suitcase and put the small jar into it. "Well, why bother to take such a big suitcase when you've only got one jar?" Sophie said. "You could put the jar in your pocket." And the BFG looked down at her and smiled. "By goggles," he said, taking the jar out of the suitcase. "Your head is not quite so full of grime sludge after all. I can see you is not born last week." "Thank you, kind sir," Sophie said, making a little curtsy from the tabletop. "Is you ready to leave?" the BFG asked. "I'm ready," Sophie cried, and her heart was beginning to thump at the thought of what they were about to do. It really was a wild and crazy thing. Perhaps they would both be thrown into prison. The BFG was putting on his great black cloak. He tucked the jar into the pocket of his vest. He picked up his long trumpet-like dream blower. Then he turned and looked at Sophie, who was still on the tabletop. "The dream bottle is in my pocket," he said. "Is you going to sit in there with it during the travel?" "Never," Sophie cried. "I refuse to sit next to that beastly thing." "Then where is you going to sit?" the BFG asked her. Sophie looked him over for a very few moments. Then she said, "If you would be kind enough to swivel up one of your lovely big ears so that it is lying flat like a dish, that would make a very cozy place for me to sit." "By gumbo, that is a squawkling good idea," the BFG said. And slowly he swiveled his huge right ear until it was like a great shell facing the heavens. He lifted Sophie up and placed her into it, and the ear itself, which was about the size of a very large tea tray, was full of the same channels and crinkles as a human ear. It was an extremely comfortable place to sit in. The nice thing about being there was that she could whisper directly into his ear. "Be careful not to fall down my ear hole," the BFG said. "You would be giving me a cronking earache." Sophie edged away from the large hole just behind her. "You is tickling me a bit," the BFG said. "Please do not jiggle about." "I'll try not to," Sophie said. "Are we ready?" "Ow!" yelled the BFG. "Don't do that." "Oh, I didn't do anything," Sophie said. "You is talking too loud. You is forgetting that I is hearing every little thing-a-ling-ling 50 times louder than usual. And there you is shouting right inside my ear." "Oh, gosh," Sophie murmured. "I forgot that." "Your voice is sounding like thunder and trumpets." "Oh, I'm so sorry," Sophie whispered. "Is that better?" "No!" cried the BFG. "It sounds as though you was shooting off a blunderbuss." "Then how can I talk to you?" Sophie whispered. "Don't!" cried the BFG. "Please don't. Every word is like you is dropping buzz bombs in my ear hole." Sophie tried speaking right under her breath. "Is this better?" she said, and she spoke so softly she couldn't even hear her own voice. "That's better," the BFG said. "Now I is hearing you very nicely. What is it you was trying to say to me just now?" "I was saying, are we ready?" "We is off," cried the BFG, heading for the cave entrance. "We is off to meet Her Magister, the Queen." Outside the cave, he rolled the large round stone back into place and set off at a tremendous gallop. And this next chapter is called Journey to London. And if you've ever been to London, you'll recognize the places he's talking about. They have to go over Hyde Park, which is this beautiful park in the center of London, and Hyde Park Corner, which is this great meeting place where free speech is practiced every day of the year. And then they get to Buckingham Palace, and they have to find the Queen's bedroom. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful chapter. The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightie, was reclining comfortably in a crevice of the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear, near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over, and this folding over bit made a sort of roof for her and gave her wonderful protection against the rushing wind. What is more, she was lying on skin that was soft and warm and almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever traveled in greater comfort. Sophie peeped over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him about 100 feet into the air. But he had not yet gone into that whizzing top gear of his when the ground became blurred by speed and the wind howled and his feet didn't seem to be touching anything but air. That would come later. Sophie had not slept in a long time, and she was very tired. She was also warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked over the edge of the ear, the landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now, with mountains and forests. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left, and for the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look, quick over there," he said, pointing with his long trumpet. And Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing, and through the murky darkness she saw, at first, was a great cloud of dust about 300 yards away. "Those is the other giants, all galloping back home after the guzzle," the BFG said. And Sophie saw them, and in the light of the moon she saw all 9 of those monstrous, half-naked brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. The strides they took were incredible. Their speed was unbelievable. Their feet pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds, they were gone. "A lot of little girlsies and boysies is no longer sleeping in their beds tonight," the BFG said, and Sophie felt quite ill. But this grim encounter made her more than ever determined to go through with her mission. It must have been about an hour or so later when the BFG began to slow his pace. "We is in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with the lights of cars moving along. And each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have seen anything except perhaps a quick black shadow flashing overhead. And all at once, a curious orange-colored glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them. "We is coming close to London," the BFG said, and as he slowed to a trot and he began to look about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there were still no lights in their windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up yet. "Someone's bound to see us," Sophie said. "Never is they seeing me," the BFG said confidently. "You is forgetting that I am doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching even the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah," he said. "Yes, but you was the very first." During the next half hour, things moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in streets. There were houses everywhere. Sometimes there were shops. There were bright lamps in the streets. There were quite a few people about, and there were no cars with their lights on. But nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into the shadows. He would glide. That is the only word to describe his way of moving. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the streets of London, his black cloak blending with the shadows of the night. It is quite possible that one or two late-night wanderers might have thought they saw a tall black shadow skimming swiftly down a murky side street, but even if they had, they would never have believed their own eyes. They would have dismissed it as an illusion and blamed themselves for seeing things that weren't there. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from his cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered in her under-the-breath voice. "I is in a bit of a puddle," he said. "You're doing marvelously," Sophie whispered. "No, I isn't," he said. "I is now completely boggled. I is lost." "But why?" "Because we is meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we is in green pastures." "Don't be silly," Sophie whispered. "This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are." "You is joking." "I'm not. I swear I'm not. We're almost there." "You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?" cried the BFG. "It's just across the road," Sophie whispered. "This is where I take over." And here is Sophie whispering in the BFG's ear, explaining that everything is fine, she knows where they are, and now Sophie directs the BFG to the Queen's bedroom. "Which way?" the BFG asked. "Straight ahead." And the BFG trotted toward the deserted park. "Now stop." The BFG stopped. "You see the huge roundabout ahead of us, just outside the park?" Sophie whispered. "I see it. That is Hyde Park Corner." And even now, when it was still an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving about Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered, "In the middle of the roundabout, there is an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and a rider on top. Can you see that?" The BFG peered through the trees. "I is seeing it," he said. "Do you think that if you took a very fast run in it, you could jump clear over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch, and over the horse and rider and land on the sidewalk on the other side?" "Easy," the BFG said. "You're sure? You're absolutely sure?" "I promise," the BFG said. "Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner." "Don't get so flustered," the BFG said. "To me that is a snitchy little jump. There is not a thing-a-ling-ling to it." "Then go," Sophie whispered. And the BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railings that divided it from the street, he took off. It was a gigantic leap. He flew high over Hyde Park Corner and landed as softly as a cat on the sidewalk on the other side. "Well done," Sophie whispered. "Now quick, over that wall." And directly in front of them, bordering the sidewalk, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all around the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. "We're there," Sophie cried excitedly. "We're in the Queen's backyard." Okay, so this is where we are going to stop today. And when we get back next week, The BFG will blow the dream into the queen's bedroom, and you'll see what happens. See you then.